If there is ever a major topic of discussion in the Legend of Zelda series, you can bet that the dungeons and puzzles within the games are always at the top of the list. Honestly, I've wanted to do a video discussing and ranking the 3D Zelda dungeons for a long time now, but of course I held back my desire to throw my proverbial hat into the ring and give my take on which dungeons are some of the best and which are some of the worst in the series. Now, of course, like all my ranking videos, this is completely my opinion, and even though many may question my choices for the best dungeons in the series, I think it's fine for people to disagree and maybe challenge me on my choices. Overall, I strive to have a channel where people can speak freely without fear of what they like being ridiculed, unless you're just a straight up, well, degenerate. So with that out of the way, what's up guys, Tactics here with another video for you. Let's not waste any more time and dive right in. Now, I will be counting most of the final dungeons such as Ganon's Castle and Tower from a few games, since they carry a very important meaning to the game as a whole, which we will get into once we get to those dungeons. But we've got 45 of these bad boys to get through, so let's kick things off with number 45. I honestly don't think most dungeons in Zelda are inherently bad, since many have significant meaning or moments to them, as I mentioned before. In fact, none of the older 3D games really have bad dungeon designs to them. Some are simply just misunderstood, or they're just not as memorable as others. However, the Water Temple from Tears of the Kingdom is without a shadow of a doubt the worst dungeon in all of Zelda. Why is the water dungeon in the sky? Why are the puzzles so brain dead? And why on earth did they make the water dungeon look like this? Did they even try to make this dungeon? Did ChatGPT design this dungeon for them? I just don't understand. I don't really need to explain why this dungeon is trash. It speaks for itself. Any OG Zelda fan out there will tell you pretty much the same thing. At number 45 is the Fire Temple from Tears of the Kingdom once again. Just like with the Water Temple, it's no surprise why this dungeon sucks. I understand that the Fire Temple, when going through the dungeon, normally has a fresh, unique take on dungeon designs with the railway system. But when you can just cheese the whole dungeon with zonai tools and vehicles, why would anyone play the dungeon normally? No one, of course, because humans are creatures that take the path of least resistance. If the solution can easily be exploited, who would pass up the chance to cheat the system, right? So these next 4 dungeons being the Divine Beast, I'm just going to mesh them all together since they are different variations of the same dungeon design. Starting with Vah Ruta, it's a water dungeon where you can use the elephant's trunk to pour water on things. Pretty neat, but once you get the idea, most puzzles become a lot more simple to solve. Meadow is all about tilting it in certain directions to be able to cross gaps by gliding around. Then there is Rudania. This one is an interesting one with an interesting concept by having you navigate through the darkness with a torch, but once the lights come on, it's back to the same shit once again. Finally, we have Vah Naboris, which is basically directing electrical currents to locations to help reach the terminals, which is the main goal for every Divine Beast, by the way. The bosses are all similar in design, which also adds to the repetition of these dungeons. Tears was better with their boss designs, but once again, the open world Zelda games were sorely lacking in good designs. The novelty of them wears off quickly by the second or third dungeon, and others can be outright cheesed with the right setup. Plus, I didn't include the final dungeons in either game, such as Hyrule Castle, because much like with the Fire Temple, you can just skip large portions of the dungeon and go straight to Calamity Ganon. I do pray for better dungeon designs in the next 3D Zelda, if nothing else. As much as it pains me to say this, Wind Waker's dungeon designs are a bit underwhelming. Many of the puzzles can be solved by pretty much a toddler given enough training, and Dragon Roost Cavern is a dungeon for babies. I understand that it's the first dungeon in the game, but I know games that came before Wind Waker that had better first dungeons than this. The dungeon item is pretty neat though. It's something we have not seen in the Zelda games before and was pretty useful throughout the entire game. It even had a fun mechanic against the boss, so props for that at least. Now you may come to realize a pattern here about me very soon, but I'm just gonna say it right now. I'm not a huge fan of fire-themed dungeons. I guess it's in my nature that I just hate being hot in real life. These places would not be somewhere I would ever want to explore, like the Goron Mines. Using the iron boots to walk along the ceiling is pretty cool, but it is also very slow. Getting the bow in this dungeon really does increase your firepower though, able to one-shot archer bokoblins with a clean one-shot. I said before that the boss fight kinda sucks in another one of my videos, so that brings it down for me a bit. But once again, not a bad dungeon, it's just a dungeon I would rather speed through as humanly possible. So we come to our very first final dungeon on the list. My reasoning for putting this one on the list is mostly for its symbolism of the entire game, where Link started out as a young boy, braving his way through the depths of the Deku Tree, taking on a creature twice his size, and then being thrust into a situation of him having to grow up into an adult at lightning speed. Even though he was a young boy at heart, through his journey he grew into a proper mature adult mentally through conquering all the challenges thrown his way. And now at the end of that journey, he has truly embraced what it's like being a man both physically and mentally. And with that, he's able to confront and take down the King of Evil as a result. The final dungeon is like a trip down memory lane, showing how far Link has come and that his journey is nearing its end. It's a really neat final dungeon to wrap up a phenomenal game like Ocarina of Time. After everything I said about Ganon's castle, you'd think this would be higher on the list than where it is, but no, it's still a fairly simple dungeon, so I couldn't put it above number 36 being Dodongo's Cavern. The second dungeon of Ocarina of Time is a mid-dungeon. Again, not too big of a fan of fire-themed dungeons or cave-like dungeons. It has some neat puzzles, but the boss was weak sauce. Literally open your mouth and insert explosive object kinda deal. There's really nothing else to say after my strange wording there that I use. But anyway, yeah, let's just move on to the next one. At number 35, we have the Fire Sanctuary from Skyward Sword. Now, this is one of the better fire dungeons that really teach you how to use your sword as more of a tool than just a weapon, by thrusting the sword to stab a cacti sort of plant filled with water and then use it to quench the thirst of some thirsty frog statues. The entire dungeon is like an obstacle course, and the magma mitts was a nice dungeon item to change up your approach to puzzle solving. The rematch with Girahim at the end was also a nice way to wrap up this solid fire dungeon as well. I think Tears of the Kingdom did a better job with dungeon designs than Breath of the Wild, despite two of the dungeons being the worst in the entire series. Running around the factory gathering the parts to build Minoru's Gundam was such a cool idea. Then having to ride the mobile suit to take down another corrupt construct is probably my favorite boss fight besides the Colgera boss fight. I really can't complain much about it. It's just one of the more clever dungeon designs in Tears of the Kingdom. As I said before, Wind Waker's dungeons were so easy that a 4-year-old could probably solve them, but I do appreciate the sort of stealth mechanic in your first visit at the Forsaken Fortress. Some people would argue that it slows the pace down by having to sneak past a bunch of moblins, but I kinda like it. Losing your sword just adds more tension to the situation since you are basically defenseless. Compare that to your second visit when you have better gear and of course the Master Sword. You can just tear through the enemies, showcasing your progress as the hero. You get your revenge on the big turkey in the sky, and you do rescue your sister in the end despite losing to Ganondorf for a second time. Overall, it's a pretty decent dungeon for Wind Waker. At number 32 is the Forbidden Woods. The atmosphere of this dungeon is pretty wild with all the vegetation around. It really makes it feel like you entered into some kind of cursed woods. The Deku Leaf and the Boomerang are your best friends in this dungeon in order to get around, even though it is a fairly simple dungeon. If there's one thing I have to give to the Wind Waker dungeons, is the amazing atmosphere of pretty much all of them. Okay, now back to Tears of the Kingdom once again. The Wind Temple is one of the more creative dungeons similar to the Construct Factory, but it still falls a bit short for having the terminal system like every other dungeon. I am giving it a bit of a pass here though, because it will most likely be the first dungeon most players go to, setting the standard of what to expect from the dungeons in this particular game, and even the build up to reaching these dungeons. Having to climb above the clouds and then dive down into the eye of the storm to reach an airship is just so epic, dude. Plus, the boss fight against Colgera was so much fun with the track playing in the background as well. Then they gave us the Water Temple right after, completely killing the hype train for what we could expect from the remainder of the dungeons. Next up at number 30 is another Wind Temple from Wind Waker. Once again, this dungeon is very atmospheric and pretty elaborate for a Wind Waker dungeon. Its verticality makes it the most complex dungeon in all of Wind Waker, with a good use of the Deku Leaf once again and the Iron Boots. Makar kinda brings it down for me a bit since you have to babysit the guy, but once he gets captured and taken to prison, the dungeon opens up and the pace of the dungeon gets better. The boss fight is also one of the best, being this gigantic worm as well. The last two dungeons of Wind Waker are a definite massive upgrade from the previous two. Alright, guess what time it is? That's right, time for another fire-themed dungeon. Ocarina of Time's Fire Temple at number 29 is the OG fire dungeon that really solidified for me how much I dislike these kinds of dungeons. The concept of Link putting on a suit to reduce the risk of having a heat stroke was a pretty cool idea at the time. It allowed the player to essentially choose a different colored tunic for Link to wear, adding some bit of customization to his fit. I don't know why, but I always got stuck or lost in this dungeon as a kid. I kept running around in circles trying to figure out where to go, when all I really had to do was jump to this elevated platform to enter the door and go to the mini-boss. But this room had this wall of fire moving toward you, so it made it difficult for my smooth brain at the time to process that I could just jump to this ledge. To this day, I still feel a little dumb for not realizing that sooner. The boss fight that proceeds after that, being Volvagia, is a nice boss fight where you play whack-a-mole with a dragon. Again, it's one of the few fire-themed dungeons that I still kinda have fond memories of, but not so fond memories, if that makes sense. Next is Twilight Princess's Forest Temple. This tutorial dungeon doesn't treat you like a complete noob and has some very well-rounded puzzles. Spanking the baboon's ass with your sword nets you the best boomerang variant in the entire series, which is the Gale Boomerang. With it, you're able to use its wind element to do some pretty neat tricks. The monkeys add an extra layer to the puzzle solving as well, making it one of the more unique dungeons in this game. If there's one thing I realized from playing Ocarina of Time is that some of its dungeons have that diving into the belly of the beast feel to it. Inside Jabu Jabu's belly literally has you diving deeper into the bowels of the guardian fish. The gross interior and sounds really make you feel like, damn, I just got eaten. The creatures inside are some of the weirdest you'll ever see, and using Ruto's ass as a deadly weapon against some of these enemies is, well, pretty funny. The boss is a parasite that you have to defeat to save the guardian fish from its grisly fate. Overall, I wouldn't mind a modern 3D Zelda game that has you diving into the belly of another beast. Now we come to the first dungeon for Majora's Mask on the list. All of Majora's Mask dungeons are very elaborate with so much substance to them, making them some of the best in the series. At number 26 is the Woodfall Temple. This is an excellent first dungeon that doesn't hold your hand, since it's assuming by now you're familiar with using the Deku Mask and knowing all of its abilities. The dungeon item is the bow, which allows you to pull off some pretty sick puzzle solving using it. The boss itself is better in the original, and I'm not sure why Nintendo thought giving it a tumor on the back of its head was necessary, but whatever. Either way, an incredible dungeon, and it only gets better from here. And if you guys are enjoying the video so far, be sure to hit that like button for your boy to push this video into the YouTube space for me, and subscribe to the channel to know when I upload if you haven't already. Thanks again, guys. Alright, now then, back to the video. Rounding out the top 20 is the Temple of Time. This dungeon is cool for its novelty alone. Being able to traverse the Temple of Time by entering through the Door of Time is an interesting idea. Climbing to the top with the Dominion Rod in hand in order to possess the giant statue, so then that you can climb back down to use the statue to finish the dungeon. It's a pretty solid dungeon in my book that I don't necessarily have any real issues with, giant spiders or not. At number 24 is the Great Deku Tree. Similar to Jabu Jabu's belly, we are diving into the belly of the beast, this time being a giant tree. This tutorial dungeon is great at what it does, introducing you to 3D environments. Learning to climb, fight, and interact with other parts of your surroundings in a 3D space is what this dungeon is here for, and it does a damn good job. I mean, who knew as a kid to jump off this ledge at the top of the Deku Tree to break the spiderweb to reach the bottom floors on their first try? Certainly not me. Facing off against the creepy spider in a dimly lit room really set the tone for the rest of your journey to be truly something special. The Earth Temple from Skyward Sword is at number 23 for its ability to be very unique with the way you get around the lava. Instead of the lava acting like some sort of pitfall that you should never jump down into and just jump over, the Earth Temple forces you on a boulder in the lava and you have to balance your way on top of the lava. Everything else about the dungeon is pretty okayish, including the boss being probably the biggest disappointment of them all. But overall, one of the very few fire dungeons that I actually had a good time playing through. Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle is at number 22. Yeah, I know, I said I wasn't going to include this one, but I guess it would be kinda weird to not mention it, since I think it is pretty fun to play through when you actually play through the, well, actual dungeon. Exploring the hallways filled with gloom and powerful monsters really makes this place one of the best locations in the game, as well as the most deadly. Having to face multiple Lionels as you work your way to the top of the castle, and also having to duck, dodge, and weave guardian laser beams is pretty sick. Best dungeon in Breath of the Wild, considering that the bar was not very high to begin with when it comes to dealing with the Divine Beast. The last of the dungeons to mention from Tears of the Kingdom is the Lightning Temple at number 21. I feel like Indiana Jones whenever I play through this dungeon, dodging boulder traps and redirecting light sources to bounce off mirrors really adds to that feeling. This is the only dungeon in Tears that actually felt like a proper dungeon that you couldn't just cheese your way through or turn your brain off. The boss fight was also quite challenging as well. This nightmare-fueled creature really had my anxiety at an all-time high while fighting it, and I definitely did not die a few times trying to beat it. A great dungeon amongst a cesspool of trash dungeons in this particular game. At number 20 is Skyview Temple. This dungeon is a very interesting one since it introduces you to the idea of using the sword as a way to solve puzzles. With the whole motion controls ability, you're able to maneuver your sword in just about any sort of direction and swing it around however you wish. At first, I had no idea that you had to spin the sword in a circular motion to cause the eyeballs to get dizzy and open the door. It was the first time that I ever thought about using my own weapon in a way to solve a puzzle, like I would any normal dungeon item. The rest of the dungeon though is fairly straightforward as you make your way to the boss, being your first encounter with Girahim. This fight was pretty tough to figure out until you realize that you have to aim for his hand at the right moment. It's a solid first dungeon for an epic story like Skyward Sword. Wind Waker's Earth Temple is the best dungeon from the 4 main dungeons for its atmosphere, the light puzzles, and cute partner. If you've watched any of my other Zelda videos, I've said I really enjoy light puzzles in Zelda, and the Earth Temple has quite a few where you're relying on Medley for most of those puzzles using her instrument at first. But once you get the mirror shield, both of you can now bounce the light off of each other's items. The atmosphere, once again, is damn near perfection for Zelda dungeons, and the boss fight is pretty goofy, but satisfying to defeat with the right skill set. I started off a bit disappointed with Wind Waker's dungeon designs, but it definitely got much better midway through the game. Snowhead Temple is at number 18, being the next dungeon you go to in Majora's Mask. I love snow and ice themed dungeons, without the weird, slippery physics of course that are involved usually. Rolling around as a Goron really adds to the great design of the dungeon, with the central hub being your main concern. Breaking down the pillars as a Goron so that you can reach the boss room seems like a simple idea, but you have to jump through quite a few hoops to reach it from different angles, and the boss fight against God is so much fun. Again, why Nintendo decided to add an eyeball to the boss, I'll never understand, but at least they didn't mess up the main part of the fight. At number 17 is the Palace of Twilight. This dungeon is fairly simple, but I love it for probably the same reason people might hate on it. The orb you're carrying back to the beginning of the dungeon with the Wall Master hunting you down is pretty neat in my book. Those creepy hands have always scared me a bit in Ocarina of Time. My only real issue is that it's so slow that you have to deliberately be moving slow for it to grab the orb and run away with it. I wish they'd made it a bit faster to increase the tension and force the players to stun it in order to be able to get away from it. The boss fight against Zant was a beautiful way to wrap up his story as Midna finishes him off by basically popping him like a balloon. Now, that has got to be a brutal way to go. At number 16, we have a very short and sweet dungeon being Sky Keep. This dungeon is way more interesting, mostly for having the ability to alter the 8 rooms around using a terminal. The main reason for this dungeon was to collect the Triforce, which I think is the only time the Triforce has ever really been a collectible item as a whole in the series. Not like collecting shards of one of them, but the entirety of the Triforce itself. It was a really cool concept that I wish they had done more with in future games. At number 15, we have Hyrule Castle Twilight Princess, which is one of the best final dungeons ever made. The dungeon is separated into 2 segments, navigating the exterior of the castle where you face off against King Bowen one final time and earn his respect, and then you learn that this ugly creature can actually speak. Then you navigate through the corridors of the interior of the castle, getting help from your allies whom you've grown to know over the course of your quest. Then finally, you face off against probably the longest final boss in the Zelda series, with a 4-phase boss fight. Defeating Ganondorf though is a very satisfying feeling when you're using the very first and only mandatory sword technique that you learn at the beginning of the game. Truly an epic final dungeon for such a grand adventure. These next two dungeons are pretty neck and neck for me, so I'm going to tackle both at the exact same time. First up, we have the Lanayru mining facility, which takes place inside a huge factory, while the sand ship is on a large pirate ship out in a huge field of sand that once belonged to a massive ocean. Both dungeons make great use of the time shift stones to send a certain area back in time, which revives monsters and can even recreate obstructions in your path. I really don't know what else to really say about the designs of these dungeons. I just think that they're both just really amazing. The boss battles are pretty solid as well, albeit one of them looking like it came straight out of some cartoon show. Regardless though, I do love both of these dungeons fairly equally. Now, I always forget that Wind Waker actually has 5 dungeons, since somehow I always forget about the Tower of the Gods at number 12. This dungeon marks the beginning of the mid-game, and despite me forgetting this dungeon exists sometimes, that is not to discredit it from being extremely good. I feel like this dungeon really does up the ante on the designs of Wind Waker. I feel like this dungeon should have been our water dungeon, with more moments of the players having to navigate through the dungeon by boat. I think half the dungeon should have been boat sections, and then the other half should have been on foot. But it feels like you only spend maybe about 25% of your time using the boat here. The boss is your standard disembodied head and hands floating in the sky. Overall though, it's a really fun mid-dungeon in this game. Okay, so yeah, Snow Peak is going to be at number 11. This could really turn a lot of heads as to why Snow Peak ain't in the top 10 at least, but well, mainly because I think while Snow Peak is a very interesting dungeon, being a huge mansion with Yetis as its residence, I just think there are better designed dungeons for the top 10. The theme of this dungeon is cool, but the design is still not quite top 10 worthy enough, for me at least. The boss fight at the end was a nice twist though, having to go up against Blizzetta, thanks to the damning powers of the Mirror of Twilight transforming her into an absolute freak of nature. Alright, we are in the top 10 best dungeons in Zelda. These dungeons are challenging, extremely robust in their design, and have unique charm to them in my own humble opinion. Starting off, we have the Great Bay Temple at number 10. I know a lot of people typically dislike the Great Bay Temple or water-themed dungeons in general, but being a special breed, I guess, I really enjoy these sorts of dungeons. Their complexity and intricate puzzles is what makes the Great Bay Temple really satisfying when you clear it. There are moments where you may not be sure what flipping the water flow in reverse is supposed to do for you until you pay a bit more attention to the pipes that snake across the entirety of the dungeon. Swimming around as a Zora in the original game is extremely fun since you get to flex your skills in a more enclosed environment. The boss fight is my only real gripe that I have with this dungeon. Imagine if the giant eel from Twilight Princess was the boss of this particular game, and if it also did something as well. That would have been way more cool than just some ugly fish. I know most people hate the Great Bay Temple, and I can understand how frustrating some parts of this dungeon can be, but it's still one of my favorites without a doubt that I will always be willing to defend. Wind Waker's Ganon's Tower is an epic climb to the top to rescue Zelda. Along the way, Link has to revisit areas on his journey from previous dungeons and essentially go through an entire boss rush of each one of the main 4 dungeons back to back. Afterwards, you have to navigate through the maze-like rooms, taking on Phantom Ganon before confronting Puppet Ganon. The reason I mention all of this is because by the time Link reaches Ganondorf at the top of the tower, that man is tired, okay? That's one of the main reasons I think why he gets caught off guard when Ganondorf launches an attack on him. I've talked about why I love this boss so much, so many times now, that I think I'll just spare you guys the details of why I think this boss fight is the greatest in all of Zelda. At number 8, we have the Shadow Temple. This dungeon is one of the creepiest dungeons in the entire Zelda series. A dark, spooky place filled with Zelda's dark history tucked away behind a graveyard. This is yet again one of those dungeons that feel like you are plunging deeper into the belly of the beast, except this time, instead of it being an actual creature, you're diving deeper into forbidden territory. A place that people wanted to keep secret from the outside world and from the public eye. However, by continuing going down the rabbit hole until you discover the boss of the dungeon toward the end, being this disembodied evil creature named Bongo Bongo. Now, there have been theories and stories of who or what this creature used to be that makes the lore of the Shadow Temple that much more interesting and dark. Truly a dungeon that players will never forget. Now, as you might imagine, I love water-themed dungeons, as I said plenty of times now in this one video alone. Even though I can't swim for shit in real life, I mean, I am black after all, like, come on, like, what do you want from me? But I still love water-based puzzles, diving deep underwater for exploration, and large sea creatures that might want to rip my head off. Besides my own biases though, the Water Temple was a pretty intricate dungeon at the time where you have to change the water level to gain access to certain parts of the dungeon. I know that may not sound too impressive or groundbreaking in 2025 as a gameplay mechanic, but back in the day, this was, well, indeed groundbreaking. The ambient tunes of the Water Temple makes this place feel very mysterious as well, plus the mini-boss being a shadow clone of Link made for one of the most iconic boss battles in the entire series. As for the actual boss, well, we don't talk about that guy. At number 6, we have another Water Temple being Lakebed Temple. Honestly, my reason for having this high on the list is pretty identical to the Water Temple. I just think the Lakebed Temple handled the water physics and puzzles better than the Water Temple. There's no need to keep equipping and unequipping the iron boots to dive underwater, even though the 3DS version of Ocarina of Time vastly improves this mechanic. Not much else to really say that hasn't already been said besides the boss fight being a pretty cool idea, but as I said before, it didn't do much despite it being this huge creature and looking so menacing. For the first of our top 5, we have the City in the Sky. The idea of a floating castle in the sky just adds to the level of epic locations in Twilight Princess. This is a long dungeon, probably because of all the waiting you have to do for the Peahats to slowly float toward you to Clawshot 2. But other than its pacing, everything else about this dungeon is damn near perfect. The double claw shot letting you zip around like Spider-Man and facing off against a literal dragon is, well, once again, I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record here, but it's just so epic, man. At number 4, we have Arbiter's Grounds. This dungeon is similar to the Shadow Temple with many spooky, scary monsters and traps that really add to that extra layer of uniqueness to the layout of the dungeon. When I go back and check out these old dungeons from previous games, it really makes me sad to see the modern Zelda games be these cookie-cutter dungeons that all have similar core mechanics of progression throughout the entire dungeon. The atmosphere of these dungeons are severely lacking as well, and the love of designing these locations just seems to be subpar compared to older games. I know the Zelda team has it in them to make some phenomenal dungeons with great puzzles in the modern games because the shrines exist. So I truly hope we get to see another Arbiter's Grounds at some point in the near future. At number 3, we have the Stone Tower Temple. As I said before, Majora's Mask dungeons are all fantastic, and what way to cap off an incredible game than with a dungeon that requires the use of all your transformation masks to complete it. This dungeon is yet another long victory lap of everything you've learned in the previous areas, and even adding an extra mini-boss for 2 dungeon items. One item is literally to flip the dungeon on its head, while the other is to fight the boss by becoming a giant. Even though the execution of the masks wasn't done super well, it was still pretty awesome nonetheless. Majora's Mask dungeon should be the textbook standard of what to expect from any 3D Zelda dungeon, in my humble opinion. You know, it's no surprise that the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time is so high on the list. I don't think there is any fan of Zelda that has ever really said anything negative about this dungeon. It's the first introduction to Adult Link's dungeons that really hit it out of the ballpark, from the atmosphere to the music and the enemies like the Post Sisters that you have to chase down in order to restore the elevator to the boss room. This dungeon really increases the stakes on how elaborate a dungeon can get, and it only got better afterwards. There's really nothing better than ending the dungeon by facing a phantom version of the guy that just got done slapping their balls in your face as a child. Hands down one of the best Zelda dungeons to ever grace our gamer minds. At number 1, we've got the Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time. Now, what's better than an adult Link dungeon than adding young Link to the mix? In order to complete this dungeon, you have to play half the dungeon as young Link in order to get your hands on the silver gauntlets. This allows you to return 7 years later to be able to move the large block of stone in your way as adult Link. The Mirror Shield is your second dungeon item that you get from this place as well, allowing you to reflect light off your shield. And as I've said before, I'm a big fan of light-based puzzles. The boss of the dungeon is Twin Rova, which is a nice mix of hitting them with the right element. It's a satisfying ending to an absolute banger of a dungeon before you go into the end game. Wait, did you guys really think that I would forget about including the best 3D Zelda dungeon in all of the series? Well, think again. Because in its own tier, we have the Ancient Cistern. This dungeon is the perfect balance of a water dungeon. There's a lot of substance that went into this dungeon, from the aesthetics to the theming and even down to the boss itself. As much as I've talked about underwater physics and other similar mechanics, I still think this dungeon has the best balance of swimming around to land traversal. The whip is such a cool concept of a dungeon item as well. My only wish is that this item got a little bit more love, and the boss fight itself is just simply amazing. Being able to take the weapon from your opponent and use it against them will never not be a cool idea. God, I just can't praise this dungeon enough. Truly a god tier dungeon that deserves every right to be at the top of my list. Alright, there you have it guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if so, be sure to smash that like button for your boy and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more RPG related content, and of course, more Zelda month. Be sure to let me know what your favorite 3D Zelda dungeons are in the comments below. Also, check out my previous video as well, where I talk about the many different Zelda races and which one would be the most fun to be if you got reincarnated in the Zelda universe. Either way, I appreciate you guys all the same, and with that, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.